The chamber was silence dressed in ceremony. 700 delegates from across the Milky Way sat in tiered rings of polished obsidian, their bioluminescent robes flickering in patterns that translated, to the trained eye, as anticipation. The Grand Galactic Council had not convened a full session in 40 years. The last time every seat had been filled, they had voted to contain a dying star. Today, they were voting on something far smaller. Today, they were voting on humanity. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the floor, alone. Not because her support team had abandoned her, they were watching from the gallery above, pale-faced and rigid, but because council protocol demanded that the accused species present a single voice. One mouth, one set of eyes to absorb what was coming. She had known it was coming for 3 months. The intelligence leaks, the closed-door sessions she wasn't invited to, the way Velthari diplomats had stopped making eye contact in the corridors. She'd reported every warning sign back to Earth. Earth had responded by promoting her to senior ambassador and sending a fruit basket. She still wasn't sure if that was optimism or an apology. High Chancellor Emreth of the Moon Directorate rose from the apex seat. His species was ancient, so ancient that their skin had taken on the gray translucency of deep space rock, their movements slow with the deliberateness of something that had long stopped being impressed by anything. He unrolled a document that shimmered with bioluminescent script and began to read. The charges were specific, 62 years of specific. Humanity had reverse-engineered Velthari navigational shielding after a single diplomatic visit to their shipyard, a visit that was supposed to be ceremonial. When confronted, the human engineers had seemed genuinely confused that this was a problem. "We just looked at it," the lead engineer had reportedly said, as if that explained everything. To humans, apparently, it did. Humanity had intervened in the Sorodros border dispute without authorization, deploying 3 civilian cargo vessels as impromptu blockades, and somehow, records still weren't entirely clear on the mechanism, talked both sides into a ceasefire over the course of a single afternoon. The Council had spent 8 months attempting that same ceasefire. They did not find the comparison flattering. And then there was the Keth funeral incident. Elena had reviewed the footage herself many times. She still couldn't fully explain it. The human cultural attaché had laughed. Not cruelly, not mockingly. The man had simply misread a Keth grief wail as a welcoming call, misunderstood the ritual silence as an invitation for participation, and laughed the way humans laugh when they are moved and overwhelmed and don't know what else to do with the feeling. The Keth had not seen it that way. 3 of them had required medical attention. Emreth's voice carried no anger. That was the worst part. When species were angry, Elena could work with it. What she heard in the High Chancellor's voice was something colder. Fear. "The Sol system has demonstrated a pattern," Emreth said, "not of malice, but of fundamental incompatibility with the stability this council has maintained for 3 millennia. Humanity does not follow established protocol because humanity does not appear to recognize the purpose of established protocol. They improvise where tradition is required. They question where deference is expected. They adapt where the law demands consistency." He paused. The chamber was so still that Elena could hear the faint hum of the station's life support systems, a sound she'd never noticed before in 3 years of attending sessions here. "These are not accusations of crime," Emreth continued. "They are observations of nature, and it is the nature of fire to burn, regardless of intent." The vote was called. Elena watched each delegate register their position on the crystalline panel before them, green for exile, red for retention. She watched the tally climb, watched green after green light up like stars forming a constellation she didn't want to read. 41-2. The Sara Collective voted red. The Tan Wanderers voted red. Everyone else voted to remove humanity from the galactic community entirely. The Sol system would be quarantined, trade routes severed, all human vessels recalled, A navigational barrier would be erected around their star, and humanity would be given 30 standard cycles, roughly 22 Earth years, to comply fully with isolation. Emreth looked down at Alina, with something she would later describe to her grandchildren as pity. The Sol system will have 30 cycles to conduct an orderly withdrawal, he said. We expect full compliance. Alina Vasquez stood still for a long moment. Around her, 700 delegates began filing out, their robes flickering with relief, or indifference, or the particular satisfaction of a problem neatly filed away. She watched them go. She thought about the fruit basket sitting on her desk back in her quarters. She thought about Earth, about the 7 billion people who were about to wake up to news that would either break them or ignite something the galaxy had never seen before. She thought about her grandmother, who had grown up in a city that had been told, repeatedly, by people with more power and more certainty, that it had no future. Her grandmother had built a school. Alina straightened her jacket, picked up her single diplomatic portfolio, and walked out of the chamber without requesting an appeal, without filing a protest, and without looking back. By the time she boarded her vessel and transmitted her full report to Earth, it was 300 GMT on a Tuesday morning. By 400, every major government on the planet had convened emergency sessions, not to mourn, not to protest, to plan. The council expected silence from the Sol quarantine zone. What they got instead was noise, the particular electromagnetic noise of construction on an industrial scale, the kind that bleeds through monitoring equipment and keeps sensor operators awake at night staring at their readouts with the quiet, creeping feeling that they are watching something they do not fully understand. Within the first 3 cycles of the quarantine, the Council's automated surveillance network, a ring of passive observation drones stationed at the boundary of the Sol system's heliopause, began logging anomalies, power signatures on Mars tripling, Titan's methane lakes partially drained and reshaped into what spectral analysis suggested were cooling reservoirs for heavy manufacturing. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, once a quiet drift of rock and mineral surveys, was now lit from within like a city scene from above at night. At Council headquarters, a junior analyst named Pret of the Dross Collective filed a report, then a second, then a third, each one slightly more alarmed in tone. His supervisor reviewed the reports, noted that the humans were likely engaged in emotional construction, a psychological response the Council's xenologists had documented in several species following traumatic political events, a kind of compulsive building as a displacement activity, and filed them in a low-priority queue. Pret requested politely that the drones be upgraded to active scanning. His request was denied. Active scanning of an exiled system was, technically, a violation of the same quarantine the Council had just imposed. The legal team was still working out the details. So the drones watched passively, and the anomalies grew. What the Council did not know, what they had fundamentally failed to account for in 62 years of observing humanity, was that humans had spent every single day of their Council membership doing what they did instinctively, automatically, and without any particular strategy, paying attention. Not in the way the elder species paid attention, cataloging, categorizing, filing. Human attention was different. It was personal. A human engineer posted to a Velthari station for a 2-year exchange program didn't study their shield technology from a respectful distance. She ate lunch with the technicians. She asked questions that seemed naive and were not. She remembered the answers. She drew diagrams in her personal journal that she technically wasn't supposed to keep. When she came home, she gave a debrief that lasted 6 hours and contained 17 technical insights that no formal intelligence operation had ever extracted. Multiply that by thousands of cultural exchanges, diplomatic postings, trade missions, and academic programs across 62 years, and what you had was not a database. What you had was a civilization that had quietly memorized everything it had ever been shown. Admiral Yina Vasquez, Alina's daughter, who had grown up listening to her mother's stories about the council with the focused intensity of someone taking mental notes, stood before a joint session of Earth's unified parliament on the fourth day after the exile verdict. She was 53 years old, built like someone who had never quite stopped being an athlete, with gray threading through her black hair and the unhurried manner of a person who had long ago made peace with large problems. She spoke for 40 minutes. She covered resource projections, construction timelines, personnel allocations, and strategic priorities. She presented a roadmap that would have taken most civilizations a century to draft. Earth's parliament had helped her refine it over the preceding 72 hours, in sessions that had largely dispensed with procedural formality and run on caffeine and the particular focused energy of people who have been told they cannot do something. Then she paused, looked out at the chamber, and delivered the sentence that would be quoted in every history written about this era, by humans and non-humans alike. Thank them later. The vote to approve the Sol reconstruction and expansion mandate passed unanimously. In the asteroid belt, the first of 11 deep space shipyards broke ground within the week. They were not elegant structures. Humanity didn't have time for elegant. They were massive, functional, and built with the kind of ruthless practicality that comes from a species that has been constructing things under pressure since it first learned to stack stones. Human engineers worked in shifts that the Council's Labor Standards Board would have flagged as violations, not because anyone forced them to, but because the waiting felt worse than the work. Meanwhile, Earth's diplomatic corps quietly began reaching out along the informal channels, the ones that didn't appear in any official council registry. The Velthari merchant captain who had once shared a bottle of whiskey with a human trade attaché and called him brother in the loose, affectionate way that transcended species. The Sara mining clan whose drilling equipment had seized up on a remote moon 3 years back, and whose entire season's operation had been saved when a human cargo crew spent 4 days fixing it for nothing but meals and conversation. The Keth biochemist who had published a joint research paper with a human colleague, whose name still appeared in the acknowledgments section. These were not intelligence assets. They were not operatives. They were just people who remembered kindness and who found, when the official channels went dark, that the unofficial ones still worked perfectly well. The black market routes opened slowly at first, then faster. Cycle 10 passed. Cycle 15 approached. Earth's compliance deadline crept forward on every calendar, and humanity did not comply, did not protest, did not petition. They simply built. And somewhere in the cold dark beyond the quarantine line, a deep-range vessel called the USCS Relentless finished its final systems check, pointed its nose toward the unmapped dark that the Council had always called the Ashfield, and quietly crossed the boundary that humanity had been told it could never cross. The Relentless was not a warship. This was a fact that Captain Dara Osai found herself explaining repeatedly in the aftermath, to Council envoys and Accord historians, and the inevitable documentary crews who wanted to frame what had happened as something larger and more intentional than it actually was. It was a deep-range survey vessel, retrofitted for extended independent operation, crewed by 212 people whose average age was 31. It carried science teams, not Marines. Its weapons loadout was the minimum required by maritime, or rather, spacetime law. It had a chef who made extraordinary jollof rice and a ship's cat named Protocol who, in an irony no one had planned, turned out to be deeply relevant. Osai was 44, Ghanaian British, and had spent 18 years charting the edges of explored space. She had the navigator's quality of comfort with uncertainty, an ability to look at an incomplete map and see not absence but invitation. When Admiral Vasquez's authorization came through, approving the Ashfield run, Os had felt something she would later describe only as recognition, as though this was where she had always been heading. The Ashfield was vast. The Council had mapped its boundaries but not its contents, treating it the way old terrestrial empires had treated their blank spaces, not as unknowing, but as deliberate. You don't mark here there be dragons unless you've been there and come back troubled. The Relentless found the first world on Cycle 15, Day 3 of the deep push. Sensor Officer Lieutenant Quame Assant picked it up first. A Class M atmosphere, electromagnetic signatures consistent with radio communication at roughly the technological level of mid-20th century Earth. He flagged it, double-checked it, triple-checked it, and then stood up from his station with the careful stillness of someone trying not to startle a wild animal. "Captain," he said, "I think we should look at this." What they found orbiting a dim orange star, 2.3 light-years inside the Ashfield boundary, was a planet called, in the native language, as they would later learn, Verk's home. Its people, the Verk, were lean and four-armed and communicated in a layered system of sound and color pattern that their linguistics AI took 11 hours to begin parsing. They had not yet achieved orbit. They knew they were not alone in the universe, because their astronomers had detected the signatures of FTL travel for 3 generations, trails of exotic radiation crossing their sky like the wakes of ships passing just beyond their horizon. They had been waiting. Not with fear, exactly, or not only fear, with the desperate, exhausting patience of a species that has been waiting to be noticed for so long that waiting has become its own kind of suffering. Their word for alien contact translated closest to the answer arriving. I broke every protocol. She knew she was doing it. She did it anyway. She landed. The Council had strict first contact procedures developed over centuries, refined through disasters, built on the genuine and hard-won understanding that meeting a new civilization badly could scar both parties for generations. Osai knew these procedures. She had been trained in them. She also knew that the Council had found these people and done nothing, for reasons she was beginning to understand and could not accept. The Relentless set down in a meadow 2 kilometers outside the Verk's largest settlement, and Dara Osai walked out across the grass, which was silver and soft, and smelled faintly of something between rain and copper, with her hands open and her crew's eyes on the back of her head. The Verk came in the thousands. They stood at the edge of the meadow for 6 hours before a single elder walked forward. He was ancient, visibly so, his color patterns dim and slow the way autumn leaves are before they fall. He stopped 5 meters from Osai, studied her with 4 eyes that held 4 different questions, and made a sound. The linguistics AI rendered it haltingly as, "Are you finally here to help, or are you here to observe?" Osai looked at the old man for a long time. "Help," she said, "definitely help." Over the next 3 days, with translators working in shifts and Osai's crew spreading out through the settlement, not as investigators but as guests, eating the food they were offered and sitting in the structures they were invited into and listening, above all listening, the shape of what the Council had concealed began to emerge. The Verk were not unique. The Ashfield was full. Dozens of species, dozens of worlds, all pre-FTL, all aware of the galactic community beyond their sky, all left in deliberate, enforced isolation because the Council had decided, in its ancient and careful wisdom, that they were not ready. The Council had never specified who got to make that decision, or what ready was supposed to look like, or what would happen to the waiting species if they ran out of time before the verdict changed. On the 4th day, Osai transmitted a file back across the quarantine line to Earth. It was not a report. It was not a formal communication. It was a navigational file, the coordinates of every world she had found, and every world her long-range sensors suggested lay deeper in the Ashfield, broadcast on every available frequency, open to anyone listening. The Council intercepted it 6 hours later. In the emergency session that followed, delegates described what Osai had done as reckless, as provocative, as an act of destabilization. What the Verk elder called it, when the translator finally rendered the full phrase, was simpler: the door opening. And beyond that door, 11 species had just heard someone knock. Dara Os had not slept properly in 9 days. This was not unusual for her during active operations, but the particular quality of this sleeplessness was different. It was the sleeplessness of someone who keeps waking up because they are afraid of missing something. Every morning on Verk's home brought new delegations, new requests, new questions that her crew's combined expertise was barely adequate to answer. The children followed her everywhere. She had acquired Protocol the cat as her unofficial diplomatic aide, largely because the Verk were fascinated by the idea of a creature that acknowledged no authority, and the elder kept requesting specifically that the small, soft animal be present at formal discussions. She had not waited for instructions from Earth. The signal delay made waiting impractical. Each transmission took hours each way. But the truth was that even if she could have had a real-time conversation with Admiral Vasquez, she would have made the same choices. Some situations don't wait for authorization. Some moments present themselves fully formed and ask only whether you are the kind of person who acts. Osai was that kind of person. The second world, Tessivar, was found by the relentless forward probe array on day 11. The tests were amphibious, brilliant, and in the middle of a resource crisis that had been developing for 60 years. Their planet's mineral deposits, the foundation of their early industrial development, were nearly exhausted. They had the engineering knowledge to reach space, but not quite the materials. They had been 2 generations away from achieving FTL capability when their minds started running dry. Without intervention, the Council's xenological projections, which OS had obtained through the same informal channels Earth had been quietly cultivating, suggested Tessivar had perhaps 40 years before societal collapse. Humanity had been mining asteroids for 20 years. The conversation between Osai's chief engineer, a broad-shouldered Kenyan woman named Amara Njoro, and the test lead engineer was one of those cross-species exchanges that becomes legendary not for its drama, but for its simplicity. Njoro had spread a star chart on the floor of the test council chamber. She'd had to print it physically because the test didn't use screens, and pointed to the asteroid belt analog in the Tessivar system, a thick band of resource-rich debris that the test had considered, but never had the launch capacity to reach. "You have everything you need," Njoro said through the translator. "You just need to go up instead of down." The test lead engineer stared at the chart for a very long time. Then he made the sound, later translated as a kind of awestruck profanity, that became the test's equivalent of a cultural touchstone, a phrase their children would use for centuries to mean the moment when the obvious becomes visible. By the end of Cycle 16, Osai had made formal contact with 6 species. By Cycle 18-11, each world was different, each crisis was different. The Kara were warlike and suspicious, and first contact had involved 3 days of standoff before Os had the inspired and arguably insane idea of simply sitting down cross-legged outside their defensive perimeter and waiting, which the Kara interpreted correctly, as it happened, as a profound statement of unarmed confidence. The Luum were so intellectually advanced that the early translation attempts kept bottoming out. Their language had 14 grammatical tenses for varieties of hypothetical causation, and they treated the arrival of humans with the enthusiastic academic interest of scholars who have just found a fascinating new primary source. None of these species were children. None of them were helpless. What they shared was not weakness but limitation, the specific, addressable limitation of civilizations that had reached the boundary of what they could achieve alone and found no hand extended across it. Humanity extended the hand. Not gracefully, there were miscommunications, offense given and taken, moments of genuine crisis that Osai managed through a combination of diplomatic instinct, stubbornness, and the willingness to simply sit with discomfort until it resolved itself. But the hand was extended, and it was taken. The relentless accords were drafted on a cargo bay floor, written in 17 languages simultaneously, negotiated over 36 sleepless hours by a crew that was running on protein rations and collective purpose. The document was not elegant. Council legal scholars would later spend considerable time pointing out its structural irregularities, its ambiguous clauses, its informal language. What they could not argue with was its fundamental architecture, which was deceptively simple. The signatories agreed to share knowledge freely, to defend each other as they would defend themselves, to make no claim of authority over any other signatory's internal affairs, and to extend the same hand when they had grown strong enough to anyone else they found waiting in the dark. 7 species signed it. The Kara signed last after a 2-day private deliberation, and their lead elder, a scarred ancient commander named Veth, pressed his mark into the document with a ceremony that his people reserved for declarations of war. He seemed to feel that this was appropriate. Later, when Osa asked him why, he said something the translator rendered as, "Because this will change everything, and things that change everything deserve to be treated as battles." He was not wrong. The transmission that Os sent to Earth on the last day of Cycle 18 contained the full text of the Relentless Accords, the coordinates and profiles of 11 new species, a resource assessment of the ash field that made Admiral Vasquez go very quiet for a long time, and a personal note that read simply, "We're going to need more ships, also more rice. Osai." On Earth, the unified parliament received the message and voted, within 4 hours, to officially designate the Relentless as a diplomatic vessel, and Osai as humanity's first outer ambassador. Protocol, the cat received no official designation, but was mentioned in the resolution's preamble. In the Council's surveillance reports, a new phrase began appearing in the data logs. Junior analyst Pret, still filing his reports into queues that no one was reading, coined it in frustration one night while staring at the numbers. He called it the Ashfield problem. His supervisors would spend the next 4 cycles learning, too late, exactly how accurate that name was. Trade, fundamentally, is not about goods. The elder species understood this in theory. Their economists had written volumes on the social and relational dimensions of commerce, but they had long since stopped understanding it in practice. When you have traded the same routes with the same partners for 3,000 years, the mechanics become invisible. You stop seeing the relationships underneath the transactions. Humanity had never stopped seeing them. In 62 years of council membership, human traders had done something that no formal economic analysis had captured and no intelligence report had flagged. They had made friends, not diplomatic contacts, not strategic partners, not formalized bilateral economic relationships with clearly defined terms and renewal clauses. Friends. The specific, irrational, inconvenient kind that call in favors and show up uninvited and remember the things you told them when you were tired and honest. Captain Relly of the Velthari merchant fleet had learned to drink whiskey from a human cargo officer named Marcus Webb in a docking bay on Velthari Station 7, 11 years before the Exiled vote. Marcus had brought a bottle of something Relly's digestive system technically wasn't designed for, and they had spent 4 hours talking about their families, their roots, the specific tedium of deep space hauling, and the particular loneliness of being away from home for long stretches. When the Exile vote came down and the official Velthari Earth trade channels closed, Relly thought about Marcus for 3 days before routing his next cargo run 16 light-years off his standard path to pass through an unofficial waypoint that existed in no registry and appeared on no council map. He was not alone. The informal economy that had always existed alongside the council's official trade structure, the gray routes, the handshake deals, the shipments logged creatively, grew with a speed that surprised even the humans who had seeded it. In the first 6 cycles of the quarantine, 37 independent trade contacts reached Earth through channels the Council couldn't monitor without violating their own surveillance laws. By Cycle 12, Earth's manufacturing output had not collapsed as the Council's economists had projected. It had increased because the informal network was not constrained by the inefficiencies of Council-standardized trade protocols. Human manufacturing had a quality the elder species had spent 60 years condescending to. It was messy. Human-made components had irregular tolerances. Human engineering solutions were often inelegant. Their construction methods had been called, in one notably uncomfortable council cultural report, aggressively practical. but messy and practical turned out to be exactly what a galaxy full of aging infrastructure needed. A Sora mining drill that had been running for 80 years and was starting to fail didn't need a perfectly calibrated replacement part. It needed something that would work in 3 different pressure environments and could be repaired with the tools already on site by a mechanic who hadn't slept. Humans made those parts. Humans liked making those parts, with the particular satisfaction of people who find complex problems engaging rather than beneath them. The Council issued formal sanctions in Cycle 14. The sanctions created paperwork. The paperwork was filed. The routes continued. On Earth, the Outer Accord support infrastructure was growing in parallel. The Ashfield species were raw partners. Their manufacturing was primitive, their interstellar capacity still nascent, but they were learning, and they were learning from a species that had never developed the habit of gatekeeping knowledge. Human engineers didn't teach the Tess and the Kara, and the Luum in the way the Council had always spread technology, controlled releases, carefully managed dependencies, the slow drip of capability that kept younger civilizations perpetually reliant. They taught the way people teach when they actually want the student to surpass them. Amara Njoroj spent 4 months on Tessivar. When she left, the Tess had a functioning asteroid mining operation and 3 of their own engineers capable of teaching the next generation without any human input. On her last day, the Tess lead engineer gave her a piece of the first asteroid-derived alloy they had produced. She kept it on her workbench for the rest of her career. The Kara were the unexpected revelation. Warlike, yes, deeply structured around martial tradition, their entire social architecture built on the premise that strength was the primary currency. This made them, in the Council's assessment, dangerous and difficult to civilize. It made them, in OSI's assessment, extremely good engineers, because their approach to mechanical problems had the same quality as their approach to combat. Identify the weak point, apply force precisely, and never stop until the problem is resolved. Within 8 cycles, the Kara had gone from pre-orbital to spacefaring, not because humanity had given them the technology, but because humanity had given them access to information, materials, and, most importantly, the attitude that of course you can do this. What are you waiting for? The Kara found this attitude simultaneously baffling and electrifying. Their own culture had a long tradition of undervaluing their capabilities relative to the Moon and Velthari, who had visited them centuries ago and left them with the clear impression that they were, and would always be, lesser. Humans appeared to have no concept of lesser. Humans looked at a Kara engineer standing in front of a half-built starship engine and said, "Great, what do you need?" rather than "Are you sure you should be doing that?" It turned out this made an enormous difference. At Cycle 20, a classified Council economic report, obtained through the same informal channels that were now handling a not insignificant fraction of galactic commerce, landed on Admiral Vasquez's desk. She read it twice, and then set it down, and looked out the window of her office at the shipyard visible through the Martian dome, its skeleton of steel and light against the rust-colored sky. The report said, in the careful language of economists trying to describe a situation they hadn't predicted and didn't fully understand, that the galactic economy was beginning to bifurcate. 2 systems were developing in parallel: the Council's established trade architecture, and something newer, faster, less formal. And this was the part the economists had underlined, increasingly capable of operating without the Council's existing infrastructure. Vasquez called her chief economic advisor, a quiet statistician named Dr. Jana Horek, and asked her what the projection curve looked like in 20 cycles. Horek was quiet for a moment. "They'll need us more than we'll need them," she said. "They just don't know it yet." The communiqué arrived at the Council's primary diplomatic relay station on the morning of Cycle 28. It was not transmitted through the standard channels. Standard channels were, technically, closed to the Sol system and its quarantine zone. This communiqué came through 17 separate relay paths simultaneously, arriving at every Council member station within seconds of each other, a technical feat that itself required capabilities the Council had not credited any of its signatories with possessing. It was written in 12 languages. 5 of them the Council's translation systems could not parse without the supplementary linguistic files included, helpfully, as an attachment. The letterhead did not say Earth. It did not say Sol System. It read in clean, unadorned script, the Outer Accord Joint Secretariat. Below the heading were 17 seals, some familiar, most not: the Sara Collective, the Tan Wanderers, the Werk Sovereignty, the Tess Industrial Federation, the Kara Defense Assembly, 12 others, species whose names the Council was only now, reading this document, learning to pronounce. The message was not long. Whoever had written it, historians would later determine it was a collaborative draft between OSI's diplomatic team, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, and a Luam linguist who had a gift for precise understatement, had understood that length suggests uncertainty. The message was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph introduced the Outer Accord as a formal political and economic entity, provided its charter document as an attachment, and noted that it had been operating in provisional form for the past 14 cycles with the knowledge and consent of all 17 signatories. The second paragraph described, in brief and factual terms, the Accord's current capabilities, its combined territory, its trade infrastructure, its collective manufacturing capacity, its mutual defense commitments. These numbers were accurate. They had been prepared by Dr. Horek's team and reviewed 3 times for precision rather than impression, because numbers that speak for themselves are more unsettling than numbers that try to impress. The third paragraph was 4 sentences. It noted that the Outer Accord had established its own navigational corridors, its own standards for interstellar commerce, and its own diplomatic protocols. It acknowledged the Council's existing authority within its own space. It expressed no hostility. And then in the final sentence, the one that would be quoted, argued over, analyzed, and eventually carved into the entrance of the Outer Accord's first permanent station, it said, "You wanted us isolated. We chose to call it a head start." The attribution was Admiral Yena Vasquez. She had said it, apparently, to her staff during a planning session on Cycle 4, in the context of a logistics discussion, and someone had written it down. The Council chamber's silence lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds after the message finished being read aloud. Several delegates later described the experience of those 4 minutes as one of the most disorienting of their political careers. The sensation of a reality you had been certain of rearranging itself underneath you without asking permission. High Chancellor Emreth sat very still. He had governed with the long patience of an ancient species, had made decisions whose consequences would play out over centuries, had held the Council together through crises that had threatened to unravel the galactic order. He was not a man given to panic. What he felt, sitting in the silence, was something he had not felt in over 300 years. He felt behind. The emergency session that followed was the most fractious in Council history. The military bloc, the Velthari Supremacy, the Dross Collective, and the Moon Directorate pushed hard and immediately for intervention. They had the fleet capacity. They had the experience. They had the deeply held conviction, formed over millennia of being the largest powers in the room, that the way you dealt with a challenge to established order was to make the challenge expensive. The debate lasted 9 hours. Delegates who had never raised their voices in session raised them. Ancient alliances showed their stress fractures. The Sara Collective's representative, who had voted against exile from the beginning, sat with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been correct and is too disciplined to say "I told you so." At hour 7, the military bloc called for the intelligence assessment. This was the moment that Pret, the junior analyst who had been filing ignored reports for 28 cycles, would later describe in his memoir as the most professionally vindicating of his life. The analyst report was compiled and delivered in real time to the chamber floor. It was not the report the military bloc expected. It was not a picture of a scrappy, defiant civilization with emotional resolve and limited actual capability. It was something else entirely. 11 shipyards fully operational. A combined outer Accord fleet count that, when the Kara destroyer wings were included, exceeded the Dross Collective standing Navy by 14% and the Moon Directorates by 22%. Not in raw tonnage, the elder species still led there, but in ship count, which in the kind of distributed conflict that a military engagement over the Ashfield would inevitably become, mattered more. And the Kara ships. The delegate from the Moon Directorate had spent 4 minutes reading the tactical assessment of the Kara destroyer wing, and then set the document down and very quietly asked for a glass of water. The Kara had not built human ships. They had built Kara ships, faster, more aggressive, designed around their own instincts and combat philosophy, but incorporating human construction methods in ways that made them fundamentally more capable than anything the elder species had seen from a civilization that had been pre-orbital less than 12 cycles ago. The aggression profile alone, the tactical modeling of how a Kara fleet would engage in open combat, had made 3 of the Council's most experienced military strategists go still in a way that experienced military strategists only go still when they are confronted with something they cannot easily categorize as manageable. The military motion failed, 27-16. Emreth called a recess. In the corridor outside the chamber, moving slowly in the way of very old things under pressure, he stopped beside a window and looked out at the star field for a long time. An aide approached and asked quietly what he was thinking. "I am thinking," Emreth said, "that we made a mistake, not the exile. The exile was logical given what we knew." He paused. "The mistake was assuming that what we knew was complete. There is a particular kind of tension that settles over a galaxy when 2 powers of significant and uncertain relative strength face each other across a boundary. Neither is quite willing to cross first. It is not peace. It does not feel like peace to the people living inside it. It feels like the moment before a storm when the air pressure changes and every living creature within range goes still and waits, reading the sky with the ancient, involuntary instinct of things that know weather matters. For 6 cycles, the galaxy lived inside that moment. The Council did not attack. The Outer Accord did not provoke. But the space between them, the navigational corridor along the old quarantine boundary, now disputed and partially dissolved by Accord traffic that simply moved through it as though it were open, became one of the most closely watched regions in the Milky Way. Both sides had vessels there. Both sides had them doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, which was to say nothing that violated any explicit agreement, and exactly what they were actually doing, which was to say everything possible short of firing. It was in this corridor on Cycle 31 that the incident happened. A Council patrol cruiser from the Dross Collective, the CDV Implacable, long-range, fully armed, crewed by 400, encountered the Kara Veth's Hammer, a destroyer named for the elder who had signed the Relentless Accords and now served as the Kara Defense Assembly's chief of fleet operations. The Veth's Hammer was on a sanctioned Accord patrol route. The Implacable was on a Council route that, technically, overlapped with the Accord route in a gray zone that neither party had formally resolved. Both vessels stopped. Neither raised weapons. Both broadcast identification. Then, for 6 hours, they simply remained there, 2 ships from 2 different eras of galactic history sitting 3 kilometers apart in the dark, each waiting for the other to blink. The Dross commander sent a formal signal ordering the Kara vessel to withdraw from Council space. The Kara commander, a young officer named Shev, 40 years old, who had grown up in the generation that Osai had first contacted, sent back a response that the Council's translation system rendered, after some struggle, as a polite but absolute refusal, accompanied by a navigational document demonstrating that the Accord route pre-existed the Council's current patrol boundary by 2 cycles, and therefore had temporal precedent under standard interstellar navigation law. The Dross commander did not have a response to this. She requested guidance from her superiors. Her superiors requested guidance from the Council's legal division. The Council's legal division spent 4 days reviewing the documents, confirmed the Kara temporal precedent argument was technically sound, and delivered a finding that the Accord route had navigational priority. The Implacable withdrew. The Veth's hammer continued its patrol. Shev's log entry for that day became required reading in Outer Accord navigation academies for generations. It was 3 sentences long. Held position 6 hours. They left. We stayed. It was not the only such encounter. Over the next 4 cycles, there were 11 similar standoffs along the corridor. In every one, the pattern repeated: assertion, counter-assertion, legal review, resolution in the Accord's favor, or in 3 cases, mutual agreement on adjusted routes that acknowledged both parties' needs. Not a single shot was fired. Not because both sides lacked the will, but because both sides had people who understood that a shot fired in that corridor would be the most expensive thing either civilization had ever done. On the Council side, those people were the Sora delegation and the Tan Wanderers, working every back channel available to them to ensure that the military bloc's pressure never fully coalesced into authorization. The Sora representative, a small, precise diplomat named Ithala, had one conversation with the Velthari Supremacy's military commander that became famous among diplomatic historians, though it was never officially recorded. It lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, the Velthari commander withdrew his motion for a preemptive strike authorization and did not reintroduce it. What Ithala had said exactly was never confirmed. The version that circulated, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, was that she had asked the commander a single question. If you fight them and win, what do you do next? And if you fight them and lose, what does everyone else do? On the Accord side, Admiral Vasquez ran the strategic restraint with the same clarity she'd brought to everything since Cycle 1. She understood, her war game models were explicit on the point, that the Accord could absorb the first strike, survive it, and respond with enough force to make the engagement devastating for the Council's military structure. She understood that this was not a guarantee of victory. And she understood, with the cold strategic intelligence that had made her what she was, that a war fought and won at this stage would cost the Accord generations of development and leave both sides diminished in ways that would take centuries to repair. She did not want to win a war. She wanted to not need to fight one. So she held the line. She kept the Accord's vessels on their sanctioned routes, maintained communication with every informal Council contact she had, and waited for the pressure inside the Council's chamber to find a different outlet. It did in Cycle 34 in the form that Vasquez had expected all along: economics. The Council's formal trade network had been contracting since Cycle 20. The bifurcation that Dr. Horek had projected was accelerating. 3 mid-tier Council species, not the great powers, but the working members who kept the day-to-day commerce of the galactic economy moving, had quietly shifted the majority of their independent trade to Accord routes, which were faster, less bureaucratic, and offered significantly better terms. The Council's economic report for Cycle 34 was not classified exactly, but it was distributed to member states with a cover note requesting discretionary handling, which in Council bureaucratic language meant, "Please don't let this become a talking point." The Sora Collective immediately let it become a talking point. The numbers said, simply and irreversibly, that the Council needed the Accord's trade infrastructure more than the Accord needed the Council's blessing. And that changed everything. The summit was held on neutral ground, a station in the L4 point of an uninhabited binary system, chosen because it belonged to no one and had no history worth arguing over. It was an ugly station, functional and cold, its corridors lit in the flat white of emergency lighting because no one had bothered to install anything warmer. Several delegates complained about the lighting. The Kara delegation said it was fine. The humans said they'd brought coffee and that helped. It was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation of terms. It was something the galaxy had not seen before and didn't yet have a clean word for. 2 systems of power, one old and one new, sitting down to figure out how to share a galaxy without destroying either of themselves in the process. Emreth attended personally. He was older than when he had read the exile verdict, 3 years older in absolute terms, which for his species meant almost nothing physiologically, but he carried those 3 years differently. They sat on him the way consequential time always sits, as a kind of weight that is not unpleasant but is not ignorable. He sat across the table from Admiral Vasquez, who was 58 now and had stopped trying to manage her gray hair, and Ambassador Elena Vasquez, who was 73 and had, if anything, become more precise with age. The three of them had reviewed each other's dossiers so thoroughly that sitting down together felt less like meeting and more like completing a sentence that had been building for years. The formal sessions lasted 9 days. The informal sessions, the ones that happened in the station's cramped mess hall at 200, over the coffee that the human delegation had indeed brought in quantities sufficient for a small war, lasted longer and mattered more. It was in one of those informal sessions that Emreth asked Elena Vasquez the question he had been carrying since the exile vote. "Did you know," he said, "when you left the chamber that morning, did you know what would happen?" Elena thought about the fruit basket. She thought about her daughter's parliamentary address, those 3 words, "Thank them later," said with the certainty of someone who has already written the chapter she's still living in. She thought about Dara Osai sitting, cross-legged outside a Kara defensive perimeter in a silver meadow that smelled of rain and copper, waiting. "We knew what we were," she said. "We knew what we'd do. We didn't know what it would become." Emreth was quiet for a moment. "That may be the most frightening thing you have ever said to me." "Or the most reassuring," Elena said, "depending on how you look at it. The agreements that came out of the summit were not a formal merger. They were not a council concession or an Accord victory. They were, in the language of the document that Accord and Council legal teams spent 4 days drafting together, a framework of mutual recognition and cooperative navigation, a structure by which both systems could trade, communicate, and resolve disputes without either one having authority over the other. The Outer Accord was formally recognized as a sovereign political entity. The Council's authority within its own space was formally affirmed. The navigational corridor was resolved into a shared zone with jointly maintained infrastructure. The 5 languages the Council's translation systems hadn't been able to parse were added to the Universal Diplomatic Registry, along with the supplementary files the Accord had helpfully provided. It was not everything. It was not even close to everything. The hard work, the centuries of integration and friction and adjustment, and the slow, frustrating, necessary process of 2 different galactic philosophies learning to coexist had not yet begun. But the shooting that everyone had been bracing for had not happened, and in the long record of galactic history, that was not nothing. 3 weeks after the summit, on the floor of the Outer Accord's new permanent station, a structure that Amara Njarod's engineering team had built with the same aesthetic philosophy as everything else they built, which was functional first, beautiful later, though later often turns out to be soon. Dara Os stood in the atrium and looked up at the 17 seals above the entrance. Shev was there. He'd brought most of the Veth's Hammer's senior crew. The Verk Elder was there in holographic transmission, his color patterns brighter than they'd been at their first meeting, warmer. The TESS lead engineer had come in person and kept touching the alloy walls with the expression of someone checking that a good thing is real. The Luum philosopher who had helped draft the summit communique had asked to speak. Os had given her 3 minutes because Luum speeches had a habit of becoming geological in length without the constraint. She spoke for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Her words, translated into 17 languages and broadcast across every frequency the Accord controlled, were these. "We were told to wait until we were ready. No one specified what readiness looked like, or who would judge it, or what we were meant to do with the waiting. Then someone arrived who did not ask if we were ready. They asked what we needed. This is the difference between those who hold doors and those who open them." In the Council's records, The outer accord was catalogued under the administrative heading of Non-Affiliated Interstellar Entity, Class 1, a category that had never existed before and had been created specifically because no existing category fit. In Earth's records, it was called the Accord, just the Accord, something that needed no further explanation, the way the oldest and most important things rarely do. On the walls of the atrium, below the 17 seals, someone had written something in marker, standard Earth marker, blue ink, slightly crooked, that had not been sanctioned by any committee or inscribed by any official hand. The station's cleaning crew had found it on the second morning and reported it to Osai, unsure whether to remove it. Osai had looked at it for a long moment. "Leave it," she said. It read, "They gave us nothing. We built everything. The doors open, come in." No attribution, no date, just the words in handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, the way human handwriting does when someone is writing fast because the thought won't wait. The Council had feared human unpredictability. In 3,000 years of governing the galaxy, they had developed a profound faith in the idea that the known was safe and the unknown was threat. They had looked at humanity, loud, adaptive, irrational, sentimental, dangerous, and seen something that didn't fit their model of how civilization was supposed to work. They had not been wrong about any of it. What they had been wrong about was the conclusion. Because unpredictability, it turned out, was not a bug in the human architecture. It was the engine of it. The same quality that had made humanity impossible to predict had made them impossible to contain. The same restlessness that had frightened the Council had driven humanity into the ashfield, into the silver meadows and the resource-starved worlds and the waiting faces of species who had been told they would have to wait a little longer. The same refusal to accept the shape of the room they were given had led them to walk out of it and build a larger one. And the door always, stubbornly, characteristically, was open. Empire was the wrong word. The elder species kept reaching for it, kept trying to fit what had happened into a shape they knew. Empires conquered. Empires imposed. Empires drew lines and said this is ours and spent their energy making sure the lines held. The outer accord drew lines and made them doors. It was not the word the galaxy had a name for yet. It would take time, and the slow, collaborative work of 17 civilizations learning each other's languages and histories and fears and jokes before the word emerged. But it was already, unmistakably, real. And it had started with a woman walking alone out of a chamber where 700 voices had just told her species it had no future, straightening her jacket and choosing not to believe them. And